So what we found is that the performance on standardized tests of math in particular, the students who are taught by teachers that went through the well-being training, they perform significantly better than students who are taught by teachers randomly assigned to the control group. And this is kind of amazing. This is like the holy grail of this kind of work. And it is an empirical proof, if you will, that flourishing really is contagious, that when teachers show up in the classroom and they're really present, they're connected to the students they're teaching, they have insight into how their thoughts and beliefs and expectations are shaping the way they see the world and see others. And they have a real sense of purpose in being a teacher. That's what we mean by flourishing for these teachers. When they show up this way, their students actually learn better and perform better. It's kind of remarkable.
Hey everyone, welcome back. Welcome to another episode of Dharma Lab. I am Cortland Dahl. I'm here with Richie Davidson, and we are in the midst of discussing a series of topics related to our new book, Born to Flourish. And in this episode, we wanted to discuss one of the core themes that is covered in our book, and indeed a lot of the work that we do, which is the idea that flourishing, our experience of flourishing, is actually contagious. And this is a topic that animates and energizes both of us. There's some really interesting science to talk about, which we'll hear more about in a few minutes. We'll also hear about some of the more practical meditative aspects, how we can actually get in touch with this and nurture this capacity. And as we always do, we'll talk a little bit about our own personal experience and how we can actually practice this in the midst of our very busy lives. But we wanted to start with a story. Actually, this is a story that Richie tells in the book, and it's such a moving story that I've heard many times. So Richie, I'll kick it over to you. Maybe you could share this amazing experience you had with the Dalai Lama at the NIH.
Yeah. So as Cort mentioned, the story is in Born to Flourish. And this took place a number of years ago. It was in, I believe, 2014 or 15, somewhere around then. And this was a time when the Dalai Lama was traveling to the US on a regular basis. And I am a scientist who's been funded by the NIH for my entire career, still funded by the NIH. And the NIH is the largest biomedical funding agency in the world. And there are some great people there and people that I respect enormously. And given the benefits that I've derived from my experience with and engagement with NIH, I wanted to have them have the opportunity to hear from someone that I so deeply respect, the Dalai Lama. And I tried to do this earlier, and it was a total bust. And then there was a new director that came in. His name is Francis Collins. Francis is a extremely eminent molecular geneticist. He was the director of the Human Genome Project, one of the most renowned scientists in the world. And Francis was the director of the NIH at that time. And I had the opportunity to first meet with him actually in Davos, Switzerland, when we were both speaking at the World Economic Forum. And that's where I really first connected with Francis. And I pitched this idea to him directly.
He's a devout evangelical Christian, right?
Yes, he
Very
is.
spiritual guy.
He's a very spiritual guy. He's an evangelical Christian. He's not, he's not a creationist, but he's an evangelical Christian. And he has a really deep spiritual core. And pardon me for those scientists that might be listening, but he's also a really humble molecular biologist, and that doesn't happen very often.
Those words don't usually happen in the same sentence without a
Yes.
negative particle.
Right. And and particularly at this time, it was a heyday in molecular genetics where, people thought that when we cracked the genetic code, so to speak, and we can sequence the human genome, everything is going to change. Of course, that's not what happened, but it was a very exciting time, and molecular biologists had this incredible sense of power because they can edit life with gene splicing and so forth. So Francis, when I first pitched this idea, he was intrigued and he asked for data as a good scientist. He wanted to see um, a video of the Dalai Lama giving talks at major American universities. So I sent him a video of a talk he gave at Harvard, for example. He also wanted to see scientific research on meditation. It was a great opportunity to educate him. And so I sent him some of our own work, some of other people's work, and he really carefully looked at all this and then sent me back a note and said, I'm on. He's willing to do it. And I should say the very first time when I tried to get the Dalai Lama invited to the NIH, it was axed because of political issues having to do with China. And I brought this up with Francis and I said, is this going to be a problem later down the road? And he said, I'm giving you the authority to make the invitation, and I'd rather ask for forgiveness rather than permission. And so he just went ahead on his own to do this. And I really respect him for doing that. So it was all arranged. And a couple of weeks before the event, Francis called me and said he'll be on campus for an hour before his talk, and he wanted to know my recommendation for labs that he may be interested in visiting during his time on the NIH campus. And for those of you who don't know NIH, it's like a huge university. It's a huge campus with many, many buildings, and there's it's an active research institute in addition to them giving out grants to other universities. And of course, I was intending and went to NIH the day the Dalai Lama was there, so I was part of his visit. And I said to Francis that, by this time, the Dalai Lama had been to many labs. He had seen scanners and, all this sophisticated equipment. And I said, frankly, I thought that what he'd be most interested in is visiting patients in a hospital. There's a hospital on the NIH campus where very sick patients are being treated with really cutting edge treatments. And many of these patients are terminally ill patients. So this hospital is really meant for people that are quite sick. And Francis was incredulous that I was suggesting this. And so we worked out a compromise where the Dalai Lama would visit the hospital and for a half an hour, and then he'd go visit a lab for another half an hour. So I was there on this day, and we decided he'd visit the hospital first. And what they did is they brought patients to the doorway of their rooms. So they were sitting in a wheelchair, or for those who couldn't get out of bed, their beds were wheeled halfway into the hallway. And it was a long corridor. And if you were walking at a normal pace, it may take about a minute and a half to go down the corridor. And there was an entourage of about 15 people, including a Nobel laureate, David Baltimore, and super prominent scientists. Anthony Fauci was there, and we were walking with the Dalai Lama. And the Dalai Lama stopped to greet every patient. And I would say half the patients knew who he was. The other half had no idea who he was. And it didn't matter at all. The Dalai Lama went up to each person. He held them, he touched them, he asked them how they're doing. And it took about 45 minutes to walk down this hallway. And by the end of the time, everyone in the entourage had tears in their eyes. And the way the Dalai Lama greeted each person was the embodiment of compassion. And he was doing with these patients what he does with everybody. It wasn't any different. But they got to see this in action. And this was an example of flourishing being contagious. The Dalai Lama was just exuding these qualities of flourishing, compassion being a central one, and it completely transformed everyone in his presence, including these patients, many of whom were terminally ill.
It's I have my own version of this story, thanks to you. Incidentally, lots of these people have we owe you a debt of gratitude. But it's exactly the same thing. I mean, you. I don't know if you even remember this, Richie, but the first time I ever met His Holiness the Dalai Lama was in Dharamsala, where I was with you at this gathering called the Mind and Life Institute and these dialogues. And I still remember you said, like, during the break, I was just in the audience, and you were kind of one of the key participants and moderators. And then you said, oh, like, during one of the breaks, you said, why don't you just come up really quick and I can just introduce you. And of course I was like, of course, like, who's going to say no to meeting the Dalai Lama? Now, just imagine, like, this is, a Nobel Prize winning laureate, a Nobel laureate, one of the most famous world political figures on the planet. And here he's got this short break in this very busy day. And I'm just some, like, random guy who he's never met. Like, this had nothing to do with me. This is just how he is. But you brought me up. But you could imagine in that situation, most people would be like, oh, yeah, nice to meet you, goodbye, and on to the next thing. You introduced me to him as a translator, which, I am and have been for many years. And you mentioned, like, I think you said, oh, he's a Dzogchen translator. Dzogchen is this kind of meditation in the Tibetan tradition. So it was something very specific, and that's how you introduced me. Well, he took my hand, as he always does when he meets somebody, and he kind of, was shaking my hand and holding it again, which he, I think, does a lot. And I was kind of kneeling there on the ground, expecting that I would just quickly shake his hand, and then, he'd get up and go to the restroom or whatever he does in a break. And instead, he sat there and he gave me just this amazing teaching on the topic that you had talked about, that he obviously knows because I'm a translator of this stuff. He knows it's like one of my passions. And I think he's like 10 or 15 minutes, he just sat there and gave me this download. Not only that, at the end of this, he then waves over to his attendant and he says, oh, could you go back to my personal library and grab this book? And then he comes back with his book in his hand. He says, this is my favorite book on this topic. You've got to read it. Like, who does that? Like, I mean, I got up from that. And again, this had nothing to do with me. It's like he's genuinely like that with everybody he meets. I mean, you hear these stories. I mean, you must have heard hundreds of these stories. It's like everybody who meets him, it's like he's just met the person who he loves most on the planet. And he's just so overjoyed and wants to just share and give. I mean, I was just so blown away by the generosity and his presence in a setting where there was just no reason for it. You would have expected the audience. I mean, you would have expected the opposite. It was, yeah. I mean, like everybody who has these interactions, I will literally never forget that. I was so floored.
Yeah,
And
and
thank you, by the way. I don't know if I've ever. I should. I
you
should
have
thank
met
you
me
in one of
many
the most
times.
memorable moments of my life, actually.
Um, and I think that one of the important things to recognize is that these qualities in His Holiness the Dalai Lama, although we all have them within us in an incipient way, we need to nurture them to really be expressed. And he has practiced on a daily basis more than anybody I know. Uh, he devotes 4 or 5 hours a day to practice, to nurture these very qualities. And it's helpful, even though it's a kind of extreme example, it's helpful to see what is actually possible. These are kind of the further reaches of human plasticity. But, the Dalai Lama is a human being. And he has put in the time and really nurtured these qualities. And we can see what the results of that are in this way. And that, for me, and I know for you, Cort, and for for literally millions of people is so inspiring.
It's so inspiring. I had a much more ordinary example of this too. And I totally agree. Meeting somebody like His Holiness the Dalai Lama, and there's people like this out in the world that really do embody the far reaches of flourishing and human potential. And it's when you see them and you interact with them, especially when you realize that they're not like this by accident, but they're like this because they've done something. They've trained themselves to be this way. It's so inspiring. I had another interaction actually just this past week that to me was a really good example of kind of a more ordinary version of how and why flourishing is contagious. I met a woman who was from an area called Kalmykia, which is actually a part of Russia in the kind of Caucasus region, very, very remote. And then she now lives in the United States, but she had immigrated, I think, first to Prague and then ended up in as an immigrant coming to the US. And she worked for many years cleaning hotel rooms, like on the cleaning staff of a hotel. And she had a boss that was an absolute tyrant. And it was horrible. She said it was like she was always berating everybody, including her. And she gave like these examples, like where she knew how exacting she was and how negative and toxic the atmosphere was. So she would be extra careful to really clean well and to do things fast and efficiently. And even so, she would come back and say, "Oh yeah, I cleaned room 417, da, 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 da." And she would always find some reason to yell at her and to kind of humiliate her and everybody else in front of the staff. So that was this environment she was in. And at the time, she really kind of hit this low point, and other things that happened that prompted her to start to look for things. Eventually, she stumbled upon meditation, and she started doing kindness and appreciation practices and compassion practices. And she talked about how um, she started to see something that you mentioned earlier, or actually in another episode, where she started to see that actually this woman was just suffering so deeply. It didn't justify the harm and the toxic stuff she was spewing, towards everybody else. But she could just see for the first time, like, wow, she is really, really suffering herself. And so she started doing this practice where every time she was being berated, in her mind, she was just saying, "I love you. I love you." And she just was like repeating this like a mantra and just kind of, she didn't say anything and she didn't do anything different, but she just was dramatically changing her attitude. And she had no expectation this was going to change anything with the woman. She just was doing this just as part of her practice. She said that first she noticed that it just completely, not overnight, but kind of erased or dissolved the way it had been affecting her, where instead of it kind of creating this whole wave of toxic emotions within her, it started now triggering this positive emotion. She started feeling love and compassion towards this woman. So she felt uplifted and inspired, even in this toxic environment. But what really surprised her was one time where they had kind of a group of new employees who were kind of on the cleaning crew, and she brought them in and she was training them, and normally of course would be quite negative and pointing fingers at everybody. And she said something like, "Oh, if you have any questions or anything, any help you need, you should ask this woman," and pointed, to the woman who I'm talking about here. And just like, she knows so much. She actually says such great work. She just started like gushing with compliments, and everybody in the room was just like what has happened here? Like, are we on a different planet? Because it was just so out of character. And this woman really just started to change. And who knows, it's maybe not entirely due to this. But one thing I think you can say to this point of flourishing being contagious is that neurosis needs a dance partner. And when you change the dance you're doing in a relationship, it opens the door to new possibilities. And you never know. You can't, of course, guarantee what's going to happen. You definitely can't guarantee the time course and the scale at which or the pace at which it happens. But there's so many examples like this where when you really shift what's going on your side of a relationship, it just totally opens up new options and things you might never have imagined. I thought that was just such a beautiful story of kind of how something that was purely internal just changed the dynamic between these two
Yeah,
people.
that's great. I love that.
So what's the neuroscience? I mean, of course, we hear about mirror neurons and all the, a lot of fancy sounding scientific angles. Is there any good research that supports this idea?
Yeah, so there's different kinds of research. And let me first start with the research that I'm most excited about, which is really documenting that flourishing really is contagious, and this kind of contagion has measurable beneficial outcomes. And so in meditation research in general, we can think of two major buckets of measures that we can take. One kind of bucket are measures that we can think of as proximal measures of what the meditation is directly doing. So it may be changing mechanisms of attention, it may be changing mechanisms of emotion, and we can measure that in many different ways, both with psychological measures, behavioral measures, and with biological measures and brain measures. Um, there's another bucket of measures that we can think of as distal outcomes. And you can maybe even add a little bit further qualification by saying distal outcomes that matter. And those kind of distal outcomes are things that policymakers, for example, care about. One distal outcome that might matter is aspects of health or disease. In economic terms, that might translate into healthcare costs. That's a big one.
It could
If
even
we
be like longevity, right? Like how long people live on average or things like that.
exactly, exactly, and actually on that particular issue, uh, we know that stress and the psychological challenges that we're facing in modern society today, the erosion of trust, the increase in loneliness and despair, the lack of meaning and purpose, all of those factors actually can lead to decreases in life expectancy. And there's a famous economist who recently won the Nobel Prize also for his work. His name is Angus Deaton. He's at Princeton, and he talks about this as he calls it deaths of despair.
Hmm.
And there are subgroups in the United States today where life expectancy is actually going down. And this is the first time in recorded history in the United States where life expectancy for any group is actually declining. And the decline in life expectancy is from these groups that are showing this kind of despair. And so life expectancy or longevity is one of these distal outcomes that matters. And so in terms of the research, one of the coolest findings that I'm most excited about comes from work that's being done in our center that's being led by a super talented young scientist that Cort and I know well, Matt Hirschberg, who also is a Dharma brother. And what Matt has been doing is looking at the impact of well-being training in educators. And these are public school educators. We've been doing this mostly in the US, but we've also been doing some of this work in Mexico. Um, and so in this new research, we looked at well-being training with our Healthy Minds program that is in the form of an app that Cort designed. We were specifically looking at a 4-week program where people are engaged with each of the 4 pillars of well-being that we talk extensively about in our new book, Born to Flourish: Awareness, Connection, Insight, and Purpose. And they spend 1 week on each of these pillars. And so this is a randomized controlled trial in public school teachers with a sample size of around 850 teachers that were randomly assigned to either the well-being training, where they were training on awareness, connection, insight, and purpose, or they were assigned to a control group. And it would take too long to explain the control group, but it was a very rigorous active control group. And we observed the usual and expected changes on the proximal measures that we took, measures of stress and anxiety and depression, where we found decreases and we found increases on measures of well-being in the teachers. And those differences were sustained at a 6-month follow-up. But what was really the novelty of this work was not the measures that we got in the teachers, but it was measures that we got in students that they taught. And so we obtained the records, the academic records of the students from the school system. And we were able to look at the students' performance on standardized tests. And we compared the students who were taught by teachers randomly assigned to the well-being training, and we compared them to the performance of students who were taught by teachers randomly assigned to the control group. Now, mind you that the students had no idea that there was even research going on.
Yeah, this had nothing. The intervention was nothing to do with the students. I mean,
Nothing.
even for the teachers, it wasn't telling the teachers how they should be in the classroom or what they should do. It had nothing to do really with the classroom.
Exactly. And and so the students were just taking their tests as they normally do and had no idea that there was any scientific research going on in the school system. Um, so what we found is that the performance on standardized tests of math in particular, but also language ability, but the strongest effects were for math, were the students who were taught by teachers that went through the well-being training, they performed significantly better than students who were taught by teachers randomly assigned to the control group. And this is kind of amazing. This is like the holy grail of this kind of work. And this is a good example of a distal outcome that matters. And it is an empirical proof, if you will, that flourishing really is contagious, that when teachers show up in the classroom and they're really present, they're connected to the students they're teaching, they have insight into how their thoughts and beliefs and expectations are shaping the way they see the world and see others. And they have a real sense of purpose in being a teacher. That's what we mean by flourishing for these teachers. When they show up this way, their students actually learn better and perform better. It's kind of remarkable.
It fits. It aligns so much with one of the most important principles you find in meditation, specifically in Buddhist meditation, which is the idea of interdependence. And the idea being, I mean, there's many different layers and levels to interdependence, but the most important from a meditative perspective is that it points to the illusion or the misperception of the separateness we feel. So almost everybody, if you just kind of look at your experience, we just kind of feel intuitively like we're sort of these little islands of experience. We're just all these kind of autonomous beings moving around the world, bumping up against each other, but we're kind of like our own little contained unit. But the idea is that that's actually a total illusion. It's actually not real. It's not how things actually are. And that in fact, if you really examine experience, if you drop that assumption and you really just inquire into experience, you observe experience, it's really that any moment of experience you have and could ever have is being shaped by countless other factors, some of which are immediately perceivable, like the stuff in your environment, some of which might be in your distant past or your immediate past, everything from what you ate in the morning to how you slept to things that might have happened in your childhood or last year. There's just this incredibly vast web of causes and conditions that are constantly shaping and reshaping every moment of experience. And among all of those, one of the most important and one of the most influential is relationship. So this again goes to precisely this idea that your relationships, especially in the present moment, are one of the things that most profoundly will shape whatever you're experiencing in the moment. So, like the Dalai Lama story, or like the story of that woman, or just imagining a teacher who maybe 6 months ago was burnt out and stressed out and came in the classroom carrying that, and now does a little practice and comes in more consciously with a sense of purpose or being caring and nurturing a sense of empathy, whatever the case may be. Like, that's just going to change. It changes this web of causality, which is influencing everything in the orbit. So all those children are kind of in that web, and then it reverberates. So one child is affected by that. It's not only they're affected by the teacher, they're then infecting the other children. So it becomes this sort of mutually reinforcing cycle. So like one thing we do at work, which, we've done this at various points, is we make a practice of appreciation. And I always love this because I have this image of like this web of relationships. And so sometimes we'll have a meeting and we'll just say, okay, at the end of the meeting, just set an intention that today you're just going to express appreciation once to somebody you work with. Like, that's it. You don't have to do anything else. Send them a text, send a nice email, or say something, whatever, just one little thing. But then you multiply that by the people that are there and what they're going to do. And again, you can just imagine you've just like sent these little viruses, little, little flourishing viruses into the system. And if you do that intentionally, it's kind of amazing because it multiplies, right? It's like exponential, because every one of those then has a ripple effect that's greater than the sort of the original action. So it's kind of amazing. And it's what's most beautiful is that we see it in this data, and that it shows up not only in how the kids feel, but in their grade point average. Or you can imagine so many different sectors of society where that ripple effect would show up in so many surprising ways. It's really kind of beautiful. And it's beautiful that we're starting to show the data that supports that.
Yeah, it really is. And the fact that we get we see for the teachers, there's clearly benefit, but there also is benefit for the students. And it reminds me of Mingyur Rinpoche, who is near and dear to both of us. He often jokes around and says, buy one, get two free.
Yeah,
And this is an example of that.
exactly. Exactly. So I was thinking of like the practical side of this. To me, I feel like there's two clear invitations that this kind of paradigm invites. One is to be really intentional about what you are infecting other people with, and to be aware that every moment, not that we should, can't just be authentic and feel what we feel and that we need to be happy all the time. But there's times where you might just choose to say, all right, I'm just about to enter this interaction, or I'm going to go into this meeting. I'm just going to infect people with a little kindness right now. I'm just going to be more present and aware, like whatever. It could be anything. It almost doesn't really matter, other than we can start to be intentional, knowing that we are influencing other people's mental and emotional state by whatever we're putting out, by whatever we're, radiating in that moment. So I think more than anything else, it's just being conscious and intentional of this process, which usually is totally unconscious and unintentional. It is one way one day and another way the next.
Right,
But
and
yeah,
just to inject one little thing here, and then when we do that on a regular basis, it will be spontaneous.
yeah,
And when we're about to meet a new person, it will just spontaneously arise to do just that.
yeah. To use, one of the topics in Born to Flourish, our book, is this idea of conscious habits. So it almost becomes automatic in a way, but not automatic in an unconscious way. Automatic in a way where intentionality and making these conscious choices becomes sort of spontaneous, but it's making you more aware, and more intentional at the same time.
Yeah.
So that's like one very practical thing to do, is just almost do a little inner reset every time you enter into an interaction, or you're going to text somebody, or you're going to meet somebody or spend time with somebody. Especially if you're going to sit down for a meal with somebody, just be intentional about what is it that you're putting out into the world. The other thing is kind of the other side, kind of realizing that you are always being influenced and infected by what you're taking in. And this is equally about intention, but here, being intentional about what you surround yourself with. So of course we can't always control, and not like we should try to hang out with only with, perfect saints or something, because that's not reality. But just be aware, like, who are you listening to? What are you talking about? What are you kind of opening your mind to, and knowing that all of that is going to influence your mind? I mean, if you're just listening to podcasts that are just telling you all the horrible things in the world, or just the rage machine that's going 24/7, like that's what those are the inputs you have, right? That's you're kind of injecting your those emotions and those thoughts and those beliefs into your own mind. So again, not that we have to be perfect and shield ourselves from that, but again, just being intentional and knowing that you are inviting that into your own mind stream is very empowering. You can just make choices where usually we're just doing that out of habit. So Richie, love to hear your thoughts. Any advice or any parting thoughts?
I don't really have much to add. I think that other than something we talked about in some previous podcasts, and that is that it's easier than you think. And so once you start doing this, and once you get into the conscious habit of being intentional in this kind of way, it really becomes easy and it's very nourishing. And so it's very self reinforcing.
And the world needs it. I think the world needs a little boost of hope and compassion, hopefully a little more insight and wisdom. So yeah, maybe we can all just do our part in little ways, little steps, many times throughout the day, just putting all of this out into the world. It's a great gift that, as you said, Richie, it's buy one get two free, because it's, even though the intention is not to benefit ourselves, it does. It's so nourishing to do that. So another great discussion. Thank you, Richie, for sharing all of your experience and wisdom as always. And for all of you for watching, for tuning in for another episode of Dharma Lab. We look forward to seeing you in our next episode. So take
Thank
care.
you, Cort.
Of course. Of course.